Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, CCSI, the Center for Energy, Petroleum,
Mineral Law and Policy.
CEPMLP. Okay. And the World Bank. It is being webcast, live-based webcast, so the audience is way larger than what you think. It's happening in the context of our executive training on extractives and sustainable development. So the goal is to offer practical insight into the challenges of good governance of extractive industries in a changing environment. So for this conversation, we have our distinguished panelists here. Kevin, you are a strategic advisor to governments and a previous Minister of Energy in Trinidad and Tobago. Peter, you are the director of the CEPMLP. And Michael, you are the global lead in extractives at the World Bank. So to start the conversation, to kick off, Michael, you've been in the field for many years. Can you share with us what challenges you've experienced lately? What is this changing environment that we're all discussing? What are the different factors and conditions that should be taken into account when you think about the good governance of extractive industries?
Thank you so much, Perrine, for having me today. Thank you to Columbia for hosting this event. It's always nice to be here amongst friends. Just looking at the audience in the room here, I recognize a lot of people that I work with around the world, so it's also nice to have you here with us today. I think that probably the challenges that we face in 2017 going forward have to do with two big topics. The first topic is obviously climate change, and climate change is impacting the extractive industries in a number of ways that we'll discuss, I think, over the next hour here. Within the World Bank Group, we look at climate change as core to our business. It really is a great challenge. It's probably the greatest challenge we faced in many decades, and it may be the greatest challenge we face this century. And so I think that's the first of two that we probably should discuss: extractive industries and climate change and how it all comes together. And then the second big challenge is one of the digital democracy and information age, where a lot more people are just far more informed than they were 25, 20 years ago. And we can have conversations like we are today. You know, we're here in Columbia University, New York. We have people connected worldwide through the web. And we're able to have these global dialogues that we weren't able to have 25 years ago. And so the challenge is really incumbent on all of us now to share information in more effective ways, to make sure that we're having conversations that build on other conversations. It's cumulative, right? And that we're able to reach people in communities and NGOs, civil society groups, inside governments, inside industry, in this uniform global conversation. As part of the second challenge, I'm also pleased that we're working more closely with UN Sustainable Solutions, SDSN, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, because I think that for a very long time we were having the same conversation in different places, and the conversations weren't converging, and so we tended to repeat conversations over and over as we went forward. Let me just speak for 1 minute on climate change, because I mentioned that as the first of the two. The World Bank is very committed to having zero carbon solutions, which means we support a lot of renewable energy. But we also recognize that renewable energy is itself very mineral intensive. And so there's a lot of new research coming out on this intensity of minerals in the low carbon economy. And surprisingly, many of these high-tech technologies are more mineral intensive than the non-low carbon technologies. And so that's a whole space that's opening up. It's a demand for new types of minerals, rare earth minerals, and precious metals, platinum, palladium, and others that haven't been used in those industries previously. But going forward, the demand for them will be significant. And as part of this, then we also are looking at just the aggregate demand for minerals, which I think is very, if I could just hit a few headline messages here, as we go from 6 to 9 billion people on the planet, and we have poverty reduction and urbanization and the development of infrastructure, those are by definitions the drivers of mineral demand. And so just the base growth of the global economy and global populations and this poverty reduction, urbanization, infrastructure, energy infrastructure conversation is really going to drive the demand for minerals going forward. So the last comment I have, just as an introductory, is that it's really incumbent on us to better manage the impacts of the extractive industries, because there will be more and more and more mineral production. And it's happening in very complicated, complex landscapes now. We have more people close to mines because we have more people. We have a better understanding of the interconnectivity between forest, water resources, mineral resources, the production of mineral resources, and all of those associated impacts. And so I think it's really the challenge going forward is also to try and manage those impacts in an ever more complex and complicated landscape. So those are my introductory comments, and I'll stop there.
All quite fascinating. Kevin, if I can ask you your government perspective, or your previous government, as a previous government official, what's your perspective on the good governance of extractive industries, these new challenges that Michael laid out? You transform across your history from an oil economy into a gas economy. Do you feel more positioned to address the climate change challenges because gas is considered to be less polluting than oil? Can we get your perspective on this?
Hi, good morning. Great honor to be here this morning with all these brilliant people. Trinidad and Tobago has been commercially producing oil and natural gas for 108 years. So production of oil in Trinidad and Tobago predates by 1 year the discovery of oil in the Middle East, in Persia. We've been producing oil before Venezuela, and when we started to produce oil, for example, there were only 3 or 4 countries in the world producing oil: the US and Russia and a couple other countries. So we've been told a story. Human beings think in stories. And that goes back to our days by the fireside. We've been told a story in Trinidad that all will be well once we have this oil and gas sector performing at a level that gives us the revenue that we need to maintain what is possibly the best standard of living in the Caribbean. That story no longer applies. In the last 3 years, we've seen our revenue from oil and natural gas collapse. And the collapse has been driven by not price only, but also by a decline in production. So we've had a decrease in production of both oil and natural gas. So we've had our revenues come down by about 50%, and we've had our foreign exchange earnings decline. The issue that we want to discuss here has to do with governance, and I'll touch on a couple of points. Recently, I went to Guyana, and I gave the Guyanese who've just discovered a massive amount of oil the do's and the don'ts from Trinidad and Tobago. One of the things that we possibly got wrong is a huge focus on subsidization of electricity and liquid fuels. So from the year 2000 to the year 2015, we spent 35 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars, which is approximately $6 billion US subsidizing liquid fuels. What that did is double the car population in Trinidad from about 400,000 to 829,000. So we have 829,000 vehicles in Trinidad, and we have a population of 1.3 million people. So if you eliminate those people below the age of 17 who should not be driving, and probably those people above the age of 90 who shouldn't be driving at all, you're probably going to get 1 car per person. It also created a huge black market because anybody in this room who is from Nigeria would know that subsidized fuel leads to black markets. It created a huge black market, and we lost a lot of our resource through the illegal exportation of subsidized diesel. So I advise the Guyanese that subsidization is not the way to go. The other thing that a booming sector, what we call a booming tradable sector, does is that it creates unrealistic and unsustainable expectations in a country. So we have a trade union movement in Trinidad that believes that whether things are good or whether things are bad, the workers who they represent must get higher wages. So we now have a loss-making state enterprise. Our oil company has been recording losses for the last 3 years because of falling production and falling price. But the representative union keeps demanding increases in wages. And at a point in time when every oil company in the world is sending home people, our state-owned oil company in Trinidad is not sending home anybody, and they're increasing salaries. So, and they've also stopped all drilling. So you stop all drilling and you're increasing salaries. That means you're no longer an oil company. It means that you are now an employment agency, right? So that's the other issues. The first one being subsidies, the second one being unrealistic expectations. And the government sits in the middle of all these, of the subsidy and unrealistic expectations. And governments always make political decisions. Well, there's a saying that good economics is bad politics. And good politics is bad economics. So you have to, governments, of course, make decisions based on the political cycle, which is a 5-year cycle. But the oil and gas industry is a much longer-term industry than that. So you have governments making decisions for 5-year cycles, and you have companies, multinationals, making decisions for 20, 30-year cycles. So there's a mismatch there in terms of strategic alignment. So those are some of my initial thoughts. We talked too about the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, our sovereign wealth fund, which perhaps came in a bit too late for Trinidad, but all the same, it's there right now.
You've had this online EI Sourcebook for 10 years, right? No, 5 years. And this year you released the hard copy. I think there is a copy for everyone here. This is here. EI Extractive Industry, EI Sourcebook. Can you explain to us? I mean, first of all, you are the author with Michael, right? Can you share with us why you transitioned from this online platform to this hard copy, and to what extent you feel it can become a tool to address this good governance of extractive industries?
Thank you, Perrine. Thank you, Perrine, for that introduction. Perrine managed to deal with the acronym, the CEPMLP, which is the worst acronym in the world. Very, very difficult one indeed. You did a fantastic job. So, and thank you, Columbia University, for the invitation here. It's very, very welcome, and thank you to Lisa Sachs in particular. Well, Perrine, your questions. We do have, for the Sourcebook, the Sourcebook is about good governance, a sort of compendium of good governance, of good practice. But we thought, well, should we do this online and make it available to everybody? It seemed the answer was an obvious yes. However, I think for those of us who've been in many countries in what's sometimes called the global south, you realize that a hard copy of a book is sometimes regarded as very, very useful. So we thought that maybe we should, in addition to having an online version, we should also have a hard copy and also a downloadable, a PDF version. So we've got multi versions now of the Sourcebook, which has taken us quite a while to get organized. Not because we're disorganized people, I hasten to add, just because it's a very, very ambitious concept. We thought that good knowledge if it were in an accessible format, would be helpful to government officials in a wide variety of countries. What really was very striking to us was that many countries have become involved in oil, gas, and mining in the last 10 years that previously, unlike, say, Trinidad, have hardly been involved at all. They don't have a history going back 100 years. They've got a much more recent history. And their need for good quality knowledge is very great indeed. And sometimes that capacity problem is really quite intense. And the people in a number of countries find themselves having to negotiate with companies that have an extraordinary capacity of qualified people. And you're having to deal with them on the basis of having hardly anybody in your government department. And I don't think that it's a matter of blaming the governments, because if you've only recently discovered the resources, or somebody has discovered them that you've given a contract to, why should you be scaling up the number of civil servants until it's clear that you do have a resource that's worth investing in? So I think there's quite a challenge for a number of countries, and we were really keen to try and make something available to them that they could use and dip into from time to time. So that's what we were trying to do with this concept. And I should add that as we were doing it, we became aware that quite a number of other people, NRGI, for example, are also doing excellent work in this same space. And also Lisa's center as well. So we quickly were latching on to the existing body of work and the existing centers, some in Queensland, some in South Africa, and getting them to do work through the Sourcebook. For example, we did quite a lot of work on gas. We commissioned some studies on gas that we're very proud of, and they went on the online version. And these have been woven, as far as we could, into the hard copy text. It's a little bit unusual in the sense it tries to deal with oil and gas. It treats gas as different from oil, and mining as well. So in that sense, it really is an attempt at an extractives compendium. Now, I'm not going to say that we've done the best possible job. We've tried to do our best, but it's a very, very ambitious idea. So what we above all we've been trying to do is contribute to a very, very large discussion that's going on, and to help governments in very, very different contexts. And indeed, the tone of the Sourcebook, I should emphasize, is one that deliberately tries to avoid, whenever we can, that horrible kind of lecturing that experts tend to get into, telling you that they know best. So it's a little bit of a challenge when you're trying to do something that you say is good practice, and then on matters of environment, you're trying to go for best practice, when you're very aware that every sovereign state and community has to try and work out their own answers to their own unique constellation of issues. So that has all been something rather challenging for us, since we know that the context in each country is so very different. I hope it's resulted in something that is useful. We did in conjunction with Michael have this idea of using the value chain as the spine to connect all of this. Whatever you see out there is often like a collection of bits, an edited collection of bits. It tends to be rather fragmented. We wanted something that was knit together like a kind of tapestry. Again, rather ambitious. I hoped it's worked. But the value chain means that we deal with legal structures in probably a lot more detail than most people have done. Also, sector organization, fiscal design, revenue management, and sustainable development. As a cross-cutting topic, we tried to deal with transparency. It's a really, really important issue. We felt transparency and accountability affected every one of these boxes. So we treated that as a cross-cutting topic. I know you could argue as well, the implementation of sustainable development policies affects every one of those. We just ended up, because we were using the chain, we put that at the end. It doesn't mean that we give that a lower priority, and I hope the way it's written makes that very, very clear. That particular chapter, by the way, got bigger and bigger as we were working on the source book. Probably that's all I should be saying about it at this stage, Perrine. Has that answered your question?
Very well. Michael, as a co-author, do you want to add to this presentation?
A couple comments. It's interesting. We 6 years ago, we started this online version, right? www.eisourcebook.org. If you look at how people research information today, they'll do a Google search, and then they'll land in the middle of something, and they just want this sort of little soundbite of information. They're not starting in chapter 1 and reading through to chapter 9, right? And so that the Sourcebook, the online platform, is hugely helpful in that regard. And then you can put a lot of supporting documents, examples of policies, laws. You can put thematic papers. You can put all of this in one space so that people do that quick Google search. They land in the middle of this value chain on a taxation issue. They get what they want, and then they go. In working with governments and civil societies and practitioners around the world, you get a number of people that actually have to have the whole universe of issues. They need to at least be able to thread together all of these different issues across this value chain. And so the print version of the source book is deliberately to be an interesting read. As Peter said, the tone, we don't want to be professorial and a bit dogmatic on issues, but to make it an interesting read across an incredible array of issues that occur in the extractive industries. And I think to Peter's point, and Kevin too, when you sit with a secretary or a minister or an advisor, they may have been 3 weeks before that over in the Ministry of Environment advising, or they may have been the fisheries minister. And they need very quickly to get up a curve on probably, arguably, one of the most complex human activities where you're extracting resources from the earth on this very complex landscape. And we have to have good governance. And governance is everywhere from environmental, social impacts all the way through to revenues management. I mean, the policies, the laws, making sure benefits are shared locally. It's just a really difficult space. So that's the way the print version of the source book has been created.
To what extent there is an uptake of all these internationally developed tools and resources within government? This is an example of a tool that is developed by the international community. To what extent technical staff within government will have the reflex to access these tools and resources? To what extent they will leverage the wealth that is developed by the international community to improve their way of thinking and governing?
Yeah, I think they do have access to it. As I was telling Peter, and he knows this, most of the lawyers who work in the Ministry of Energy in Trinidad are graduates from CEPMLP, right? From the center in Dundee, with the long acronym. And they have access to best practice, to international laws, and so on. One point I want to make, which follows from, and this deals with good governance, and it deals with the point you are making too. They may have access to all that. That's great. What's happening in Trinidad, and I told the Guyanese government the same thing, is that the salaries that are paid, and this I think is a huge point, the salaries that are paid to public servants are much less than the salaries that are paid to their opposite numbers, their equivalents in the multinationals in Trinidad. So as a minister, what I had is that every Monday morning, the secretary would come and said, somebody wants to have a chat with you. And they would come and sit very quietly and said, Minister, I got a job offer from BP, and I really have to go because they're paying 4 times more than the ministry. And I would say, you have to go. I mean, it's your life, And we lost a lot of good people like that. And that, therefore, then creates a asymmetrical relationship in terms of the experience in the ministry versus the experience in the multinationals. So we had a situation, we have an environmental management authority in Trinidad, and eventually when you meet with the multinationals, you think you're meeting with the environmental agency, because you would see people representing the multinationals in meetings, and I'm not calling the name of any multinational here, who were just a few weeks ago working with the environmental agency. So that's an issue. It dilutes the effectiveness of governance, because you keep losing your best people to the multinationals. I'm sure it happens all over the world, and I've told the Guyanese government, do not let it happen, because the effect would be that the best and the brightest Guyanese end up working for Exxon, and the not so best and brightest, I don't want to be unkind, end up working for the government, and that is going to affect your governance.
Perrine, is it working okay? In relation to a point that Michael made earlier, at the very beginning, he mentioned climate change, and I was thinking about clean air and water quality. Something that struck me when we were working on the Sourcebook, on the sustainable development chapter, was that I had thought perhaps that we would find examples of regulations being introduced to compel companies to do various things in relation to water quality or to promote clean air. But actually what was more striking when you looked at both oil and gas on the one side and mining on the other was the extent to which companies themselves are increasingly taking action and developing standards, usually through associations, to try and improve issues of, say, water quality or clean air, issues that are in some way related to climate problems. And that development of standards, I thought, it surprised me. I think I know a little bit about the field, but it's clearly something that's happening more and more as investors are coming under more pressure to be more transparent, to be more proactive. And I think that's a good development for governments as well, that instead of you having to take the initiative and introduce some regulations in a top-down way, here you have companies that with a little bit of encouragement are prepared to take a lot of the actions in these very important areas.
We'll take questions from the floor. So if you can introduce yourself. Oh, yeah. And use the mic. Yeah. So, Manuel.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This is a direct question to Kevin from Trinidad and Tobago. Sierra Leone resonates a lot with the examples you've given from Trinidad and Tobago. One of the key challenges around governance issues is the attrition of good public servants, moving on the opposite side. But you mentioned that you advised the Guyanese government. Would you be more specific as to what possible models or approaches that such a government could put in place to stem this flow or reduce this wave?
Well,
Emmanuel from Sierra Leone, head of the local content agency.
First time I'm meeting somebody from that country. Colombia. And Peter would be familiar with Colombia. Dr. Zamora is a colleague. Dr. Zamora is a colleague in Dundee with him. Colombia in 2003 established something called the ANH, the Association for National Hydrocarbons, which was an agency outside of the ministry. And they were able to therefore pay salaries equivalent to industry. Because in Trinidad, the Ministry of Energy sits in the wider public service, the salaries that we could pay in the ministry have to be determined by everybody else's salaries. So if I wanted to increase the salaries of my lawyers, I would have to justify why am I not increasing the salaries of the lawyers in the Ministry of Agriculture. And I would go on and say, but my lawyers are petroleum lawyers, and I would have to fight this battle, right? So the solution is to create a statutory agency outside of the ministry, which allows you to pay salaries equivalent to the private sector. If you don't do that, I told the permanent secretary one morning, I said, P.S., one morning you and I will come to work and there's nobody here, right? So that's my recommendation. Create a agency outside of the ministry, which allows you to pay private sector equivalent salaries.
Hi, Patrick Heller from NRGI. I have a question about the Sourcebook, or the sort of the online version of the Sourcebook. I'm just curious, after the years of experience that you've had, it's a very ambitious tool, and I think to your credit, you were trying to build something that was very comprehensive, but that people could access in a different way than may have been traditionally accessed. Just interested in what lessons have emerged. Have people used it in the ways you anticipated? Are there ways in which people have honed in on that you didn't expect? I'm just sort of interested in, as we're all thinking about how to reach audiences, it would be very helpful.
Great question, Patrick. Good to see you. I love that segue. It's interesting. If you look at the Sourcebook, we could look every week and every month, and you would have 2,000 people across a month on there doing something. In the early years, people would go on and just massively download documents. So we have a colleague at Dundee, Daniel Gilbert, who's been, he was tracking this for us. And you could see the residence time of people on there and what they were looking at in terms of thematic areas. One thing that we've come to appreciate is that inside the World Bank, we started the EI Sourcebook in the extractives part of the World Bank, and then the governance global practice, they actually started Goxy, which is a social networking tool, and I think Goxy has maybe 3,000 plus people a week on there, right? And so one of the things we've learned is that we have to start to take these different products and converge them and meld them together. And then we've got the SDSN, which is this network of practitioners. We have to get everybody in the same space in the digital world, so we're doing that. We're actually going to revise Goxy and make it the front-end user interface for the Sourcebook. If we look at the Goxy conversations, we can also run these reports to see what topics are most often discussed and what parts of the world. And it varies according to what's happening on the planet. Different news stories, something big will happen, and then you'll see that kind of becomes the flavor of the month for a while. So we do monitor and watch this closely. I think that going forward, it's important for us to try and converge other tools, the Goxys, the Sourcebooks, the networks, and get it all in one. NRGI has a user community. Get everything in one space, because it's been a bit fragmented till now, and it feels, being one of the architects of the Sourcebook, it feels that way. It feels like we created something that is a piece of a fragment of a bigger picture.
I'm not. 3 seconds. Okay. I would agree with that. I think that's right. So, and I think you see more of that fragment idea in the print version, where we refer to many other documents and also online sources than I think we do at the present time in the online version. There's a slight disconnect at the moment, but that's going to be addressed. That the print version is more up to date than the online version. But we certainly, I think, as with the passage of time, we realize that certain other resources are now becoming available that tend to be more focused. I mean, the negotiations portal is one example, but it would be terrible not to refer to those sources at strategic points, because it allows the user to follow through a topic that might be introduced to them through the source book, but to go into more depth through those particular resources that are now becoming available. Quite a lot of these. I mean, they're really, really very good. It is a burgeoning space. So in a sense, for governments, that could be a problem in that you can have too much information, too many resources. Hopefully, some structure has been provided by the source book. We've certainly tried very hard to try and do that. So if it's a fragment, it's a fragment that we're trying to connect to a bigger picture, although that's really more Michael's job in going forward at the bank. Is that okay, Michael?
My name is Agodbat Mushabe. I work with the Great Lakes Institute for Strategic Studies based in Uganda. I want to ask a broad question to Michael. You know, given the fact that the World Bank has its footprints in many countries around the world, I'm just wondering what are your, success stories in terms of countries that who have their economies dominated by extractives, and what would you use to as the measure of success?
I always love these webinars because you get to ask the impossible question, right? And the whole world's watching. I think that we have several different measures that we use traditionally. So, and some of them are just terrible measures. So a measure of success could be the quantity of revenues generated and where that goes in the system. Increasingly, I think that we have to appreciate that the real impact of extractive industries has got to be locally. Right? You have to have shared prosperity. And so we have to reduce poverty. The extractive industries, to be successful, they should be reducing poverty, not contributing to or just maintaining status quo. But in addition to that, you have to have shared prosperity. And that prosperity has to get to the local level. It can't be shared prosperity in the capital or shared prosperity with an ex-minister and gone somewhere else. And so I think that in looking at these extractive industries and this conversation on good governance, that's where we need to go more and more. And that's why, as I said in some of my early comments, the source book is a practitioner's guide for advisors, for ministers, but it's also something that community members or a community organization could use. It's not written at a level that it's beyond the grasp of those who should be benefiting most from extractive industries. So, and now I'll share with you our traditional definition of good governance, because everybody keeps saying we're trying to improve governance, right? So governance has three components. We always look at the policies and laws and the regulations, and we try and strengthen those. And that's sort of technical work. The second element is the institutions and the professionals. And we do have this Kevin's problem, that when you build the capacity of institutions and individuals, the individuals often do migrate away. And that's just the reality of this industry. So we often in the World Bank train 5 with the expectation 1 or 2 will remain and 3 will go off to the industry. But if they stay in that country, then that's a gain for the country. But the third piece of governance, I think, is the one that we have been underappreciating, which is accountability and transparency. We've done probably more on transparency in the last few years than we have on accountability. And that accountability has to come down to that local level again. We have to make sure that we're leveraging these industries to reduce poverty, but there is a shared prosperity down there. And if there's not, then I think that should be the red flag for us. That's the measure. And then to which countries? There's a long list of countries that have succeeded in a macro way, and they often get cited, the Chiles of the world, so that the whole macroeconomy has been laterally and vertically strengthened. But then there are some countries that they haven't realized that level of success, but they do have more prosperity at the local level. And you see it when you go out and visit these mines in those countries. I think those are the countries we should try and push more to the top going forward. And I won't give any specific names because I'll leave it to your imagination to decide what they might be. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. My name is Gloria. I work with the Ministry of Energy in Uganda. I have two questions. One for Peter. University of Dundee is very popular with its programs, and a lot of people from developing and developed countries have benefited. Do you have any partnerships that are scaled down to the local countries so that these maybe a shorter version of the training programs are offered at a local level, and have these been successful? And then secondly, to Kevin, did Trinidad and Tobago transition from more politically motivated decision-making regarding natural resources, and how did they make this transition, if it happened?
Well, I'll kick off here with the first question. Does my center have any partnerships? We have had a number of partnerships over the years, and we found that the key thing about partnerships is everybody likes the idea about partnership and cooperation, but you've really got to look very closely to make sure that something happens as a result of the partnership. So we tend not at the moment to be very keen on formal agreements, but when it comes to actually doing things, we do offer a number of on-site courses. There's always a problem for people who are busy government officials, and particularly in departments where there aren't many of those officials available. To get them away for long is very, very difficult. But they might be just the kind of people that you want to have in a training session. So usually what we try and do is organize a training program on site, maybe for a week, for that kind of person. For other people who have a similar problem but want maybe something more intensive, we find the distance learning model is something that's quite useful. But what we're finding at the moment is that more and more students or prospective students are looking for scholarships. So what we're trying to do is try and obtain funds, or to increase our pot of funds that allow us to offer scholarships. And we've actually managed to increase that quite significantly. So we're very pleased about that. That's not quite what you were focusing on, but I think it is a sign of the times. If somebody from Ghana, for example, I would like to look and say, have we got any money to help that person to come? And that's something I now consider to be part of my job. I encourage all my colleagues to do that. Talk to companies and try and get companies to give money for scholarships. Very good for companies, because it means that as interlocutors, they have got qualified people to talk to. There's no point complaining that you don't have enough talent on the government side if you're negotiating. Provide money for scholarships. And so far I've found that quite a number of them are very, very keen to do that. We do try and organize partnerships still when we can. We've recently concluded one with the China University of Petroleum based in Beijing, which will send us several dozen students every year in the future. So we're still very much open for discussion if anybody wants to raise that. Thank you.
Trinidad decided to go into liquefied natural gas. Then there was an election, and the government changed. And the new government said, you know what, this is a great project. Let it proceed. Then we had in 2010 a smelter that was planned, aluminum smelter, and there was a lot of environmental activism against it. The government changed, and the new government said, we are not proceeding with the smelter because the people are against it, right? And recently, the government changed again, and when the government changed, the new government that came in, so my government lost the election. The new government that came in, they inherited a lot of projects, and they decided to review all these projects. And after a year, they decided that these are good projects, and the projects have proceeded. So it's a mixed bag, but I think we have to move more in the direction of less political interruption, because international investors and investors on the whole, they like certainty. And they like to know that if a government changes, there's not going to be a radical shift in the policy direction of the country. So to cure that, what we are doing, and we are an evolving society, is that we've created in the parliament, because the parliament is the legislature, the government is the executive. We've created in the parliament an energy committee in the parliament. And the energy committee is made up of opposition members of parliament and government members of parliament. And what that does, it allows for the opposition to have an appreciation for what is happening in the energy sector. So the opposition isn't locked out from information. So if the opposition by chance becomes the government in a few years, they won't be starting from a point of total ignorance. They'll have that knowledge of what was happening in the sector, so there should be a smoother rollover from government to government, because we tend to change governments quite often in Trinidad. We've changed governments 6 times in 30 years. So.
Hi, my name is Mel Babasuna from the Extractives Baraza, Kenya. I've got a question for you, Michael, and one for you, Kevin. So for Michael, one of the things, so Kenya is a frontier region, like the rest of East Africa. And what has happened is, as I'm sure has happened for everybody else, you've got a lot of people who want to get trained very quickly so that they can be able to address any of these governance issues or whatever it may be. And what happens is that you've got government or CSOs that go out into the wonderful universities like Dundee, and they either do the executive trainings high level or they do the 4-year courses. And when they come back, there's the ones who do the 4-year courses or master's courses, there's no placement, can't just, it's hard for them. And for government officials, we don't really get to see changes. So a lot of us are feeling that it's, especially when the World Bank is funding these training courses, it's almost like a wasted effort. Because to expect somebody to come to an executive training for 2-3 weeks and then go back and make enduring change is rather hard. And so we are exploring a reverse sort of model, and we wonder whether the World Bank is doing anything on this, whereby the World Bank, instead of sending out people to these great universities, they actually get experts to come in-house for 6 months to a year, whatever it takes. Because then it's easier if you bring in a geologist from whatever to come and sit in. And so far, governments seem to be a bit amenable to that, but it's usually a question of cost. It's too expensive to bring them, but for me, then the cost is offset by taking in 3-4 government officials for executive training. So I wonder if that sort of model would be something you'd consider or you've considered, if there's any examples. And then my second question would be to Kevin. So I've been to Trinidad, fantastic country, fantastic people, and everything seems free. And that's a good thing. We like free things as developing countries. But I guess what I'm trying to get from you is how you arrived at, as government, the decisions to spend socially, okay? And not so much the freeness, but really quality services, the negotiations around that, and how then you negotiated the social license to operate for companies, because we don't hear of protests or social unrest in Trinidad. So if you have any comments on that.
I was having with Patrick before. The increase in revenue, we went from a quadrupling of the economy from 1999 to 2008, in a almost 10-year period, the GDP of Trinidad quadrupled. And the quadrupling of the economy was directly related to an increase in natural gas production, which was to supply ammonia, methanol, and LNG projects. So the country got a lot richer very quickly. The government at that time decided to commensurately increase government expenditure on free tertiary education and free drugs, not illegal drugs, free drugs for persons who are sick, subsidize cooking gas, subsidize electricity, subsidize liquid fuels, subsidize housing, subsidize water, and subsidize everything. So what has happened now is that oil prices and oil production and gas production are all down, and we still have this huge expenditure overhang. So the government at this point in time in Trinidad is now looking at what they could cut back. So they're beginning to take away a lot of the freeness. And I was giving Patrick the example of what subsidies do. In the year 2005, we completed train 4 of the LNG trains, and the government was awash with money. And then the government said, okay, tertiary education is now free. So tertiary education is free for citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So what that did is in the year 2006, you couldn't get a place to park in the university. The following year, the university car park was totally full. And the year after, the university had to build new car parks outside the university because the money that the parents would have spent on tuition fees was now being spent to buy a car. And then the cars started to get more expensive. So the focus was on consumption. And I think one of the questions directed to Michael from the World Bank is, what are the benchmarks of success? And we must remember that what we're doing here is that we are decapitalizing the country. Any country that has an extractive industry, you're extracting capital from the ground, you should ideally replace that capital with something else. So the focus should really be on capital formation and not so much on consumption. So Trinidad has had a big focus on consumption through all those free things you spoke about, and that is now beginning to recede. And there's a new reality, a new normal now in Trinidad, which is where the government is beginning to transfer the burden of running the country onto the shoulders of the population. And that is always something which people push back at. Right? Thanks.
This is the first part of the question, and also, if you don't mind, communicate your final points, because we're getting to the end of the session. So we'll start with your final remarks, and Kevin and Peter afterwards. But first, addressing.
So capacity building is always one of the most difficult things in the World Bank, right, when we build capacity. We have two types of consultancies, really. One, they're delivering a technical product. So a consultancy has been brought into a country, and they build a cadastre, a licensing system, and they deliver that, or a financial management system for EITI, and they deliver that. And arguably, the government gets the product, but it's hard to see sometimes attribution of increased skills as a result of that. The other type of consultancy is when we bring in advisors, and we just place them at different points in the ministry. And I mean, it's valuable that if their content is important. So if they're advising on a policy on mine development or gas development, that they're giving a good, sound advice. But what's also interesting is just how they introduce a culture change in terms of professionalism and how they do things. And that's really valuable and underappreciated, I think. That when you bring in that consultant from that other country, wherever they come from, and they just sort of are mentoring, and they're often it's a man or a woman who are probably past the age of 45, 50, and they kind of have this approach of fostering a culture of change, and that's been hugely helpful. And so, in any country where we can do that, I think obviously we're interested in outcomes. So absolutely, we would support an approach like that. In terms of final comments, I think that this is our first soft launch of the Extractive Industries Sourcebook, and I can tell you that there's a lot of demand out there for something like this. We have a downloadable PDF, which in the first week and a half, I think that we've had that, or week, we've had more than 450 downloads. And that's the tip of a tremendously big iceberg that we know is out there. We're going to send some complimentary copies to different institutions, to some government people. If you want to take some copies, we have some today. Otherwise, we'll build a list and send those out. Because we really we know there's a tremendous need for this sort of broad narrative that goes across all these topics. And that's what I think this product will deliver. And let me just, because in my closing remarks, I want to thank again Columbia for hosting us, and for all of you and people online to have sat through and listened to us. Yeah.
Thank you to Columbia for having me here, and it's a great opportunity and experience. On the issue of development, my closing remark would be there's been a huge focus on revenue. I think the problem really resides with expenditure in countries. The EITI, of course, focuses on measuring revenue and accounting for revenue, but doesn't focus on how the governments spend that money. So they focus on collection and not on spending. With regard to fiscal systems, which I have some expertise in, having been a former economist with British Gas and a former Minister of Energy who amended and changed a fiscal system, I always stress to governments and private sector people that fiscal system has to strike a balance. There's always a focus on the government maximizing revenue, and that could happen at the expense of making the investor uncompetitive. And when that happens, you have a reduction in investment, and low investment means production falls. So we have to be careful we don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. So the fiscal system has to strike that balance between returns to the state, fair returns to the state, and fair returns to the shareholders of the companies that invest. Those are my closing remarks.
Okay, just two closing remarks. First of all, let me emphasize that with this source book, one of the things that we've been very aware of is how the body of knowledge about oil, gas, and mining is evolving. It's still evolving. And it's also becoming more democratic. It's more accessible. Evolving is important because certain practices maybe 20, 30 years ago might not have been necessary or not have been recommended. Now some of them might be regarded as being mandatory, especially once you get to the environmental area. But sovereign wealth funds, for example, the discussion about that maybe 15 years ago was completely different. People like me can remember developments in the North Sea which were very, very, very basic or influenced by a body of knowledge that now looks very, very basic indeed and quite poor. So a lot of countries, whether it's Sierra Leone, Angola, Kenya, they're getting involved in the development of these industries at a time when the benchmark is much higher. I don't mean that necessarily they have to strive harder, but it's actually just a lot of knowledge now, great quality, is there for them. It's available in a way that it was not when Norway and, say, the United Kingdom were starting out. A lot of things they just didn't know. They didn't know that decommissioning was important. You don't have to wait for that. It's there. Second thing is point of view. We've been talking about courses, executive training. You mentioned in relation to the World Bank. I would say that there are many different kinds of training that are possible and desirable. We've done a few. We did one in Ghana. We did one recently in Nairobi. The Nairobi one was really designed to go over a model contract and just talk to various people in government about a production sharing contract and try and just explain to them, look, this is how it reads if you look at it from a different point of view to the ones that you've been getting so far. And we went through that. We sent somebody, went through that contract through maybe 4 days, quite intensive with a number of officials. And they were really grateful because they said, well, we thought we knew what this contract was about. And it's not that we were interpreting it in a completely different way. We were just bringing the kind of, let's say, the independence of spirit that you would expect from people in an academic space to bear on this contract, and then saying, it's yours, or at least this is the one that you're going to be working with. So what you do from now on is really up to you, but we're happy that we've been able to help. And that was about 4 days in Nairobi that I think was very well spent.
Very much. As we heard, there is a wealth of resources and assistance out there to understand better how to face these challenges. I think CCSI, NRGI, CEPMLP, and the World Bank, Kevin, in his own capacity, we all try to adapt ourselves to this changing environment. It's changing faster than we anticipated, and we always feel like the industry gets it before governments and civil society, so we want to help government and civil society catch up and make sure that they don't develop outdated policies, whether it comes with subsidies or local content or fiscal regime. We're really available to make sure that it's not happening. I'd like to invite you to give a round of applause to our three experts here.